what if the moment a narcissist realizes they're guilty is actually the moment they become the most dangerous? Most people expect guilt to create honesty. They expect a confession, an apology, or at least some sign of remorse. But with someone who has built their identity around appearing flawless, guilt often doesn't lead to accountability. It triggers survival. Stay with me, because by the end of this talk, you'll understand why the behaviors that confuse you the most, denial, rage, blame, silence, and even fake kindness, are often signals that deep inside they already know the truth. If you've ever watched someone deny what was obvious, make you question your own memory, or somehow convince everyone else that you were the problem, this conversation is for you. Listen carefully until the end, because recognizing these patterns can change the way you respond forever instead of remaining trapped in cycles that slowly erode your confidence. When a narcissistic person realizes they have done something wrong, many people expect guilt to lead naturally to confession, reflection, or a sincere apology. Instead, what often emerges is something much more powerful than guilt itself. Shame. Although these emotions are closely related, they are fundamentally different. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am the mistake for someone whose identity depends on appearing superior, flawless, or beyond criticism. This distinction becomes crucial. Admitting guilt can feel like admitting they are fundamentally defective. So the mind instinctively searches for ways to escape that unbearable feeling. Rather than processing responsibility, it mobilizes defenses designed to protect a fragile sense of self. This helps explain why their reactions often seem confusing or disproportionate. A simple question about their behavior may be met with anger, mockery, complete denial, or a counterattack. These responses are less about the specific situation than about avoiding the emotional collapse that shame threatens to bring. If they were to fully acknowledge the harm they caused, they might have to confront painful beliefs buried deep within them, such as fears of being unworthy, insignificant, or unlovable. Instead of facing those internal wounds, they push the discomfort outward, attempting to make someone else carry it. That is why conversations that begin with accountability often end with confusion. The focus shifts away from the original issue and toward defending yourself, explaining your intentions, or proving your memory. Their energy is directed toward preserving an image rather than repairing a relationship. This does not necessarily mean they never experience guilt. In many cases, they may recognize on some level that they have acted unfairly. The problem is that guilt is quickly overwhelmed by the much larger fear of shame. Protecting their identity becomes more urgent than acknowledging another person's pain. Until someone develops the capacity to separate making a mistake from believing they are entirely worthless, genuine accountability remains incredibly difficult, because every admission of fault feels like a threat to their very existence rather than an opportunity for growth. Denial is often one of the first psychological defenses a narcissistic person reaches for when they know they are guilty. To an outside observer, it may appear as deliberate lying or manipulation, but beneath the surface, it frequently serves a deeper emotional purpose. Accepting responsibility would require them to confront a version of themselves that clashes with the image they work so hard to maintain. If they see themselves as always right, morally superior, or beyond criticism, admitting fault creates an internal conflict that feels deeply threatening. Instead of allowing that conflict to exist, the mind automatically searches for ways to erase it, minimize it, or reshape reality, so their self-image remains intact. This is why denial can be so convincing. They may insist an event never happened, claim you misunderstood their intentions, or argue that you are exaggerating. Sometimes they rewrite details with remarkable confidence, not because every word is carefully planned, but because acknowledging the truth feels emotionally intolerable. The more serious the mistake, the stronger the denial often becomes. What seems like stubbornness is frequently an attempt to avoid the intense discomfort that comes with recognizing personal failure. Denial also protects them from the vulnerability that accountability demands. Admitting wrongdoing requires humility, empathy, and a willingness to tolerate uncomfortable emotions. These qualities involve accepting that relationships can survive imperfection and honest conversations. For someone whose emotional security depends on appearing strong and faultless, vulnerability feels dangerous rather than healing. They may believe consciously or unconsciously that if they admit one mistake, others will see them as weak, reject them, or strip away the admiration they desperately seek. As a result, conversations become exhausting cycles where facts are questioned, evidence is dismissed, and responsibility is constantly redirected. You may find yourself repeating the same events, hoping clarity will finally lead to understanding, only to discover that the discussion never reaches its original purpose. The denial is not simply about protecting a single action. It is about protecting an entire identity built on the belief that being wrong is unacceptable. As long as that identity remains more important than genuine self-reflection, denial becomes a shield that blocks both accountability and emotional growth. Projection is one of the most revealing behaviors a narcissistic person may display when they know they are guilty. Rather than sitting with the discomfort of their own actions, they unconsciously or deliberately place those unwanted qualities onto someone else. Instead of saying, "I acted selfishly," they accuse you of being selfish. Instead of admitting they were dishonest, they begin questioning your honesty. Instead of acknowledging manipulation, they insist that you are the one trying to control them. This reversal serves an important psychological purpose because it allows them to distance themselves from the painful reality they cannot tolerate within themselves. For the person on the receiving end, projection can be deeply confusing. You may enter a conversation expecting to discuss a specific behavior that hurt you, only to find yourself defending your character, your motives, or even your sanity. The original issue slowly disappears as the focus shifts onto your supposed flaws. This change is rarely accidental, whether conscious or unconscious. It redirects attention away from the narcissist's responsibility and places emotional pressure on the other person. Before long, you may begin questioning whether you really were the problem, even when the facts suggest otherwise. Projection also helps preserve the idealized image the narcissistic person has created of themselves. If they believe they must always appear strong, moral, intelligent, or superior, accepting evidence that contradicts this identity creates unbearable emotional tension. By assigning those unwanted traits to someone else, they temporarily escape the inner conflict. They can continue believing they are the victim, the misunderstood one, or the person who has been treated unfairly even when their own behavior initiated the conflict. This pattern becomes especially powerful because it often triggers emotional reactions. Feeling falsely accused, you naturally try to explain yourself, defend your intentions, or prove your innocence. The more energy you spend responding to the accusations, the less attention remains on the behavior that started the discussion. In this way, Projection becomes more than a defense mechanism. It becomes a strategy that protects a fragile self-image while keeping accountability at a safe distance. Unless this pattern is recognized, the cycle can repeat endlessly, leaving one person burdened with blame while the other remains shielded from confronting their own actions. When a narcissistic person realizes that the evidence against them is too strong to ignore, many people expect that this will finally be the moment they admit they were wrong. Instead, it is often the point where anger and blame become even more intense. This reaction is not simply about avoiding consequences. It is an attempt to escape the emotional threat that accountability represents. If admitting fault feels like admitting personal worthlessness, then attacking someone else can seem psychologically safer than facing that painful reality. Anger becomes a shield, and blame becomes a way of redirecting attention away from their own behavior. This explains why seemingly calm conversations can suddenly become emotionally explosive. A simple question such as, "Why did you do that?" may be answered with accusations about your attitude, your past mistakes, or your supposed inability to understand them. Rather than discussing the specific issue, they expand the conflict until everything except their own actions becomes the topic. They may bring up unrelated events from months or even years ago, hoping to create enough confusion that the original concern is forgotten. The discussion shifts from accountability to self-defense, leaving you emotionally exhausted while they avoid confronting their own conduct. Blame also serves another important purpose. If they can convince themselves that someone else caused their behavior, they no longer have to experience the discomfort of personal responsibility. Statements such as, "You made me react that way," or "If you hadn't done this, none of it would have happened," transfer ownership of their choices onto another person. This creates the illusion that they were responding to circumstances rather than making independent decisions. Over time, the person receiving these accusations may begin accepting responsibility for actions that were never theirs to carry. What makes this pattern particularly damaging is that repeated blame can gradually reshape another person's confidence and judgment. Instead of trusting their own observations, they become preoccupied with avoiding future criticism or emotional outbursts. They walk on eggshells hoping to prevent conflict, while the narcissistic person continues avoiding genuine accountability. As long as anger successfully intimidates others and blame successfully redirects responsibility, there's little internal pressure to acknowledge guilt or develop healthier ways of responding to mistakes. And before we go further, if you're committed to understanding the deeper emotional patterns behind toxic relationships and reclaiming your peace, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else may need these insights today just as much as you do. Gaslighting is one of the most powerful ways a narcissistic person may attempt to protect themselves when they know they are guilty. Instead of directly facing the reality of their actions, they create confusion around the situation until the other person begins questioning their own memory, emotions, and perception. The purpose is not always simply to convince someone of a different version of events. It is often to weaken their confidence in what they already know. When a person starts doubting themselves, it becomes much easier for responsibility to be avoided. When confronted with their behavior, a narcissistic person may deny obvious facts, minimize what happened, or suggest that the other person is overreacting. They may say things like, "You're too sensitive, you always misunderstand me," or "That never happened the way you remember it." Over time, repeated statements like these can create emotional uncertainty. The person who was hurt begins spending more energy analyzing their own reactions than examining the original behavior that caused the pain. The focus shifts from what happened to whether they are even allowed to feel hurt. Gaslighting works because human beings naturally seek consistency and connection. When someone we care about strongly rejects our reality, we may try harder to understand their perspective rather than immediately accept that they are avoiding accountability. This creates an internal conflict where the victim begins wondering if they are being unfair, dramatic, or mistaken. The narcissistic person gains relief because the attention moves away from their actions and toward the other person's confusion. However, genuine accountability does not require someone to destroy another person's confidence. A healthy person can hear criticism, acknowledge harm, and have a conversation without needing to rewrite reality. Gaslighting does the opposite. It protects the person's image by making the other individual question their own experience. The deeper issue is that facing the truth would require humility, emotional honesty, and the willingness to accept imperfection. When those qualities feel threatening, creating doubt in someone else can become a way to escape the discomfort of guilt and preserve the illusion that they did nothing wrong. Silent treatment and emotional withdrawal are often used by narcissistic individuals when they feel exposed, challenged, or unable to control the direction of a conversation when they know they have done something wrong. Facing the consequences can create intense emotional discomfort. Instead of engaging in an honest discussion, they may choose to disappear emotionally or physically. This withdrawal creates distance, but it can also function as a way to avoid accountability while making the other person feel the pressure to repair the situation. The silence can be confusing because it sends a powerful emotional message without any direct communication. The person on the receiving end may begin wondering what they did wrong, whether they should apologize, or how they can restore peace. This uncertainty can shift the emotional burden away from the person who caused the harm and onto the person seeking resolution. Instead of the guilty individual reflecting on their actions, the other person becomes focused on ending the tension and bringing back connection. For some narcissistic individuals, silence also becomes a way to regain a sense of power. When they feel their image has been damaged or their behavior has been questioned, withdrawing attention can create a feeling of control. They may believe that if they withhold affection, communication, or approval, the other person will eventually become anxious enough to approach them first. The focus then moves from their wrongdoing to their absence, allowing them to avoid the discomfort of admitting fault. However, emotional withdrawal does not resolve conflict. It only delays the necessary conversation. Healthy relationships require the ability to discuss mistakes, acknowledge pain, and work toward repair. Silence used as punishment prevents emotional growth because it replaces understanding with fear and uncertainty. It teaches the other person to focus on avoiding rejection rather than expressing their needs honestly. The deeper reason behind this behavior is often an inability to tolerate vulnerability. Admitting guilt requires accepting that they are imperfect and that their actions have affected someone else. For a person who depends heavily on maintaining a certain image, silence can become a protective wall that keeps painful self-reflection away. But avoiding accountability does not erase the truth. It only creates more distance from genuine healing and emotional connection. False remorse is one of the most confusing reactions a narcissistic person may display when they know they have done something wrong. On the surface, it can look like genuine regret. They may apologize, express strong emotions, promise that things will change, or suddenly become more affectionate. However, the difference between real accountability and false remorse is found not in words, but in the consistency of their actions after the situation is calmed down. True remorse focuses on understanding the harm caused, while false remorse often focuses on escaping consequences and restoring control. When a narcissistic person feels that their reputation, relationship, or personal benefits are at risk, they may become highly motivated to repair the image that has been damaged. The apology may appear at the exact moment they fear losing access to something important, such as attention, admiration, or emotional support. Their concern may not be centered on the pain they caused, but on the discomfort they are experiencing because their behavior has created consequences. The goal becomes removing the threat rather than transforming the behavior. This is why some apologies feel emotionally powerful, but lead to the same patterns repeating later. They may say all the right things, acknowledge just enough responsibility to calm the conflict, and promise a different future. Yet, if there is no deeper reflection, no willingness to listen, and no consistent change, the apology becomes another way to escape accountability. The emotional intensity creates hope, but the absence of lasting action reveals the truth. Genuine remorse requires humility. It means accepting that another person's pain is valid, even when admitting fault feels uncomfortable. It involves changing behavior without needing constant reminders, praise, or immediate forgiveness. A person who is truly accountable understands that trust cannot be demanded. It must be rebuilt through patience and reliability. The most important thing to recognize is that emotional displays alone do not prove emotional growth. Tears, promises, and affectionate gestures can create a moment of connection, but only repeated actions reveal whether someone has truly accepted responsibility. Without that internal change, false remorse becomes a cycle where temporary kindness covers unresolved patterns, allowing the same wounds to appear again and again. Genuine accountability requires emotional maturity, empathy, and the ability to look honestly at one's own behavior, which is why it can be so difficult for a narcissistic person to demonstrate when they know they are guilty. Accountability is not simply saying I was wrong. It requires a deeper process of accepting discomfort, understanding another person's experience, and making changes even when those changes challenge the way someone sees themselves. For a person who depends heavily on protecting their self-image, this process can feel threatening because it requires them to face parts of themselves they would rather avoid. Emotional maturity allows someone to separate their actions from their identity. A mature person understands that making a mistake does not mean they are worthless. They can admit failure without feeling destroyed by it. This understanding creates space for growth because they no longer need to defend every action or shift blame onto someone else. However, when someone views mistakes as proof of personal weakness or humiliation, they may focus more on protecting their image than repairing the damage they caused. Empathy is another essential part of accountability because it requires stepping outside of one's own perspective. It means recognizing that another person's feelings are real and that their pain matters, even if accepting that truth is uncomfortable. Without empathy, an individual may acknowledge an event happened, but remain disconnected from its emotional impact. They may focus on why they acted a certain way instead of understanding how their behavior affected someone else. True accountability also requires consistency. A person cannot simply apologize when consequences appear and return to the same patterns once the pressure disappears. Real change is demonstrated through repeated choices, honest conversations, and a willingness to accept feedback without becoming defensive. It requires patience because rebuilding trust takes time. When these qualities are missing, guilt often becomes something to escape rather than something to learn from. The person may defend, deny, blame, or manipulate because those responses feel easier than facing personal responsibility. But growth begins only when someone can sit with the uncomfortable truth that they have caused harm and still believe they are capable of becoming better. Without that willingness, guilt remains a threat to their identity instead of becoming an opportunity for transformation. The moment a narcissistic person realizes they are guilty reveals more than just their reaction to a mistake. It reveals their relationship with truth, vulnerability, and accountability. While a healthy person can face discomfort, accept responsibility, and use guilt as a path toward growth, someone trapped in deep patterns of shame may see guilt as a threat to their identity. This is why denial, projection, blame, gaslighting, silence, and false remorse often appear when they feel exposed. But understanding these patterns is not about becoming consumed by their behavior. It is about recognizing what is happening so you no longer carry responsibility for someone else's refusal to face themselves. You cannot force someone to develop self-awareness. You cannot create accountability for someone who is committed to avoiding it. The only thing you can control is your own clarity, your boundaries, and the way you respond. The greatest freedom comes when you stop trying to convince someone to admit what they already know. Start trusting your own experience. Truth does not become less real because someone denies it. Your pain does not become invalid because someone refuses to acknowledge it. Real healing begins when you stop chasing explanations from someone who is protecting their image and start choosing peace over endless emotional battles. At the end of the day, guilt can either become a doorway to transformation or a trigger for more defenses. The difference depends on whether a person has the courage to face themselves honestly. Those who embrace accountability grow stronger, but those who constantly run from the truth remain trapped by the very patterns they are trying to hide.